verses 9 through 14, titled The Parable of the Pharisee and the Tax Collector. To some who were confident on their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this here tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his chest and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Here ends our reading for this morning. Now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Let me start this morning by opening with some biblical comparisons. The first one is coming from the Old Testament, and it begins, the Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, there were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now, a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took that ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. At this, David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, you are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why? Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Then Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. Now I ask, who in our gospel reading would you picture as David? The Pharisee or the tax collector? Which one had separated further from God our Father? Or maybe I could look at another person in the Bible. One day as Jesus was standing by the Sea of Galilee with the people crowding around him and listening to the word of God, he saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were now washing their nets. Jesus then got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the shore. He then sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into the deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Simon then answered, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets. When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners to the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. And when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will catch men." So they pulled their boats up on shore and left everything and followed him. Now I ask, who in our gospel reading would you picture Peter as? The Pharisee or the tax collector? Which one had drifted further from God? Or maybe I need to ask, who do you see yourself as in our gospel reading? Maybe the question is not whether we identify or see ourselves as either of them, because really, haven't we all been both of them a time or two in our lives? The Pharisee was, as the world figured, a respectable man, the very best role model of a church member imaginable. He went to church, not at a small country church, but to the very best church, to the temple that was built around the Ark of the Covenant. The gold box that contained manna and Aaron's staff and Moses' stone tablets of the law. The Pharisee didn't even go there to buy or sell doves or even to exchange money, but he went there to pray and to worship. He not only went to church, but he lived it out. He was honest in all his dealings. He gave 1/10 of his income to the church. He wore the best clothes. He fasted 3 times a week. He looked the best in the community's eyes, but not so in God's. Now, the other guy in Jesus' parable, not one good activity is told about him. The tax collector was what most people would call a bad man, a very bad man. He was wicked, and God knew it. The people around him knew it. He knew it himself. He was a sinner. He was a no-good, money-grubbling, cheating Roman collaborator. So bad that when people would see him, they would cross the street to pass him on the other side of the street so they wouldn't touch him. So when Jesus spoke of these two men, a Pharisee and a tax collector, it was as though he had spoken about the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and a rapist, or Billy Graham and a prostitute. They were complete opposites. The Pharisee, truthfully, was a highly regarded, but he looked at only the things on the surface. His heart was the furthest from God. He had not kept the law as it should be kept. When he prayed, he gloated about himself and about what he had done. He was a me type of guy. No thanks was given to God by him for his generosity. The tax collector, however, humbly confessed his sinfulness. He had no good works to offer. He saw himself as the grime of the earth. And because he knew his sin, he knew he could expect only God's justice, true judgment and condemnation. He knew his fate so well that when he prayed, he stared at the direction he knew he was heading and beat at his heart with all the regret in the world. He knew there was only one avenue of escape for him. He knew he had to throw himself at God's feet and to appeal to his mercy for a pardon and forgiveness. So I ask, whose shoes would you choose to fill and call yourself? A Pharisee or a tax collector? Which one stands further from God in your eyes? Just like that tax collector, we are all sinners. And if we are sinners, then it was our shortcomings that nailed Christ, the Son of God, to the cross. Is there anything worse that we can do? Can we slump any lower? Can we disgrace him any more? And the answer is no. And so now there is also only one escape for all of us, and that is to follow the tax collector's example. Made to cry out the same words he chose. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. The words God and me, a sinner, they are profound. Profound because they express how your heart, your soul, and your conscience feel. and the insight gained when you have come to know who Christ truly is and how God's true presence you suddenly feel within you. There is no better way for the worst person in the world to feel. We do not truly know true life, unless we know Jesus through and through. Because if we do not know God, no matter what we have done, whether fed the poor, preached the word, or seen the empty tomb, no matter how blessed we see ourselves, how holy or how wise we think we are, in reality, we are none of the above. Unless you have stood for years knocking at the locked door, your knuckles bleeding, you do not really know what prayer is. Until you have felt the burden of sin lifted from your shoulders and placed on Christ, you don't know what salvation and justification feel like either. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. The Greek word translated for have mercy on me is hilasterion, which means mercy seat. That part of the Ark of the Covenant, that gold object that Indiana Jones found in the first movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark. The Ark was a wooden box about 3 foot long, covered in gold. The lid was the mercy seat, was pure gold and had on each end angels whose outstretched wings stretched over the top of that mercy seat. So once a year on the Day of Atonement, the high priest sprinkled blood from an animal without any blemish that had been killed only moments earlier out in the courtyard of the temple. That animal was a substitute. It was an innocent victim dying in the place of the sinful people who deserved to die for their errors. The ark, it was a beautiful object I can only imagine seeing. But that ark was stolen and later returned by the Philistines. David had it brought back to Jerusalem, and Solomon, David's son, had it placed in the temple upon its completion. However, the fate of the ark is a mystery. All we know is that the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 A.D., and nobody knows whatever became of the ark since then. Thankfully, however, now when God looks down, he sees not the law of Moses that had been broken by each of us, but instead the blood of an innocent victim, a spotless lamb, a true offering for God's mercy, his son given for each one of us. He sees that the final payment, the final offering, the final sacrifice that only he could give was thankfully given. And so his love goes out in mercy to save the one who comes to him through faith in that one final sacrifice. That Pharisee in our reading, he just didn't get it. His faith was in his works, not in the sacrifice that was given. He couldn't look at the tax collector and forgive him. And guess what? Grace still works the same way. It can only be received by those who have learned to forgive others as well. Only the merciful can receive mercy. The Pharisee had enough religion to be moral or of good quality, but he didn't have enough to be humble. And so as a result, his religion drove him away from the tax collector rather than towards him, the one who needed his help the most at the time. Maybe Jonathan Swift said it best. We have just enough religion to make us hate, but not enough to make us love one another. The Lord awoke David with the death of his firstborn. He had faith in God to defeat Goliath, but he didn't have him truly in his heart to be saved until he saw his true mistakes. Peter got to see Christ work firsthand. He even called him Lord. His inner battles fought with him even as he walked on the beach with Christ on that day of ascension. Then finally on the day of Pentecost, when the tongue of fire descended on him, and he, you could say, was spiritually baptized, he was finally forever changed. We might not get to slay a giant or see the Lord walk on water or even have our tongues of fire land on us. Maybe his calling of us was more like that tax collector. Maybe the one called Levi or Matthew. where the Lord simply said, "Follow me," and Levi got up and left everything and followed him. He became a true disciple. The Pharisees, they complained to his disciples, and Jesus answered them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." David, we read that he became a changed man. Peter, from the book of Acts, we learn that he helped them to change the world. Now, we don't know for sure what became of that tax collector, or even the Pharisee. But who knows, maybe the Pharisee was Saul, the one the Lord called Paul. And in the end, finally had his blindness lifted when the scales fell from his eyes. And then he also helped to change the world. Truth is, we are all sinners. None of us are any better than that tax collector. None of us deserve God's mercy. God's mercy, which was brought for us by the one who loved us the most. God's beloved Son, paid the price none of us deserve. Let our praise and love for him be never ending. Like his love for us, let us give him our all. Let's not be like that Pharisee and let our pride of legalism ever hold us back. Let's not let anything here on earth keep us separated from God. Let us place our stones, our separation from God, at the foot of the cross. Anything that is a barrier between us and his love for each of us, let us place it at the foot of the cross. Let us take our fears, our burdens, our humanness, and place them in his hands. In his hands that were where they need to be from the start. In the Lord who loves us the most, where our salvation lies. In his gift of love and sacrifice that he gave for each of us. Let us place our burdens there at his cross and let them go and carry them no further. Amen.